The laughter started before she finished her sentence. Calla had known it would. She had known it the moment she pushed open the door of the Larimer County Land Office and stepped inside out of the dust. Her canvas apron still tied at her waist, hay clinging to the hem of her patched grey dress like a mark she could never fully scrub away. The clerk behind the counter had looked up. The two men seated along the wall had looked up. And then all three of them had settled back into their expressions the way men settle into chairs they own, comfortable, unhurried, entirely certain of what they were looking at. A stable girl. She said what she had come to say. She said it plainly, because she had rehearsed it enough times in the dark of the stable at Harlan Peck's property that the words came out straight and without trembling. She told them that Peck had forged the deed, that the parcel of land on the north ridge of the valley, the 12 acres her father had broken his back clearing before he died, had never been sold, that the signature on the transfer document was not her father's hand, that she had her father's letters, 3 of them, written in the months before his death, all of them naming that land as the thing he was leaving to her. The laughter was not loud. It was the quiet kind, which was worse. The clerk pressed his lips together. One of the seated men looked at the ceiling. The other turned to his neighbor with something in his eyes that was not quite cruelty, but lived in the same territory. "Girl," the clerk said, with the particular patience men use when they are not being patient at all, "Mr. Peck has held that deed for going on 8 months. It's been filed. It's been witnessed. You'd need more than a few old letters." "I have the letters," she said. "I heard you. And I have his original survey mark, burned into the post at the northeast corner. My father put it there the year I was born. I know what it says." The man by the wall made a small sound in his throat, not quite a laugh, something adjacent to one. She left before she said something she could not take back. The door swung shut behind her, and the October wind hit her full in the face, and she stood there on the boardwalk, with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, breathing through her nose, watching the street of Ember Flats go about its morning as if nothing in the world were wrong. Nothing was wrong, not for most of them. A wagon rolled past, loaded with timber. A dog crossed the road at a diagonal, indifferent to everything. Across the street, 2 women in good dresses came out of the dry goods store and paused on the step to talk. They glanced at Calla, and then glanced away, and that glancing away was its own kind of answer. She had been in Ember Flats for 4 years. She had worked Peck's stable for 3 of those, since her father's health went bad, and the money dried up, and staying on the land alone was more than she could manage without income. She mucked stalls at first light, and fed horses at dusk, and did whatever Peck's foreman told her to do, without complaint, because complaint was a luxury she could not afford. She was not invisible in this town. She was simply not the kind of person whose words were expected to carry weight. She turned and walked back toward the stable. It was Silas Croft who saw her leave the land office. He was standing outside the sheriff's building, one shoulder against the post, a cup of something that had stopped being hot some time ago, held loosely in one hand. He had been sheriff in Ember Flats for 6 years, long enough that the town had stopped noticing him, the way people stop noticing furniture. He was not a man who invited notice. He wore plain dark work clothes that had seen hard years, and he moved through town at the same unhurried pace, whether there was trouble or not, and the pale grey of his eyes had a stillness to them that new people in town found unsettling until they understood what it meant. It meant he was paying attention. He had seen the stable girl before. Calla. He had learned her name the way you learn most things in a small town, not by asking, but by listening. He knew she worked Peck's stable. He knew she kept to herself. He knew her father had died the previous winter, quietly, in the small house at the base of the ridge. And he had noticed, in the months since, that Harlan Peck had begun to develop a particular interest in that ridge. He watched her come out of the land office. He watched the set of her jaw and the way she stood for a moment on the boardwalk, with her hands pressed flat against her sides, and he recognized the posture of someone who had just been dismissed. He set down his cup. He crossed the street at his own pace, not hurrying, because men who hurry in times like these tend to say the wrong things, and he had learned years ago that the first thing you said after someone had been humiliated mattered more than almost anything that came afterward. "Miss," he said, when he was close enough. She looked up. The storm grey of her eyes was careful and flat, the way eyes get when someone has schooled themselves not to show too much in public. "Sheriff," she said, "you look like you had a useful morning." A pause. "I doubt that's what you'd call it. What did they say?" She studied him for a moment. She had spoken to Silas Croft perhaps 4 times in as many years, always briefly, always in passing. He was not a man who came to the stables. He was not a man who made small talk. The fact that he was standing here now, asking her this, was outside the usual shape of things. "They said I'd need more than letters," she said. "They said the deed's been filed and witnessed. Harlan Peck has held it for 8 months. Silas looked at the land office door and then back at her. "Do you have the letters?" "In my room at the boarding house. 3 of them. My father's hand." "What else?" "Survey mark, northeast corner of the North Ridge parcel. My father put it there before I was born. Iron post with a stamp mark. I know what it reads." Silas was quiet for a moment. It was the quiet of a man doing something behind his expression, adding up. "Come to the office this afternoon," he said. "Bring the letters." She looked at him directly. "You believe me?" It was not quite a question. He answered it anyway. "I believe you're worth listening to." That was not the same thing, and both of them knew it. But it was more than she had gotten inside that office, and it was more than she had expected to get anywhere in Ember Flats on a Tuesday morning. She nodded. "This afternoon." She went back to work. Calla had come to this valley with her father when she was 11 years old, arriving in a wagon with everything they owned inside it, and the whole of the high desert spread out before them like a promise that might not keep. Her father, Thomas Briggs, had been a patient man and a stubborn one, and he had looked at the North Ridge parcel with its thin grass and its rocky soil and its single Sweetwater Creek and decided it was enough. He had built their house from timber he cut himself. He had cleared 12 acres over the course of 3 years, working from first light until the light was gone, and Calla had worked beside him from the moment she was old enough to be useful. She had her father's letters in a flat tin box under the floorboard in her room at the boarding house. She had put them there after he died, when she understood that whatever she had was precarious, and that precarious things needed protecting. The letters were not elaborate. Her father was not an elaborate man, but they were dated, and they were specific, and in the 3rd and last of them, written 4 months before his death, he had described the land plainly. The North Ridge parcel, 12 acres, held in his name, to pass to his daughter Calla at his death, not to be sold or transferred. Harlan Peck had filed a deed of purchase 8 months ago, 6 months after Thomas Briggs went into the ground. The dead, it turned out, were easy to put signatures on. Peck's stable sat at the west end of town, a long, low building that smelled of horse and old hay and the particular sourness of years of wet leather. Calla spent the middle of the day doing what she always did, cleaning stalls, checking feet, throwing hay. The horses did not care who she was. That was one thing she had always liked about them. Peck's foreman, a thick man named Doyle, came by at midday with a message she did not ask for. "Peck wants to know if you've been talking to anyone at the land office." She did not stop working. Why would he want to know that? Because it's his land and his business, and he's particular about both. Doyle leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed. He was not a cruel man individually, but he served a cruel employer, which in her experience amounted to the same thing eventually. Word gets around. Word gets around fast. Small town, Doyle said. He was watching her. Best leave it alone, girl. That land's his now. You keep poking at it, you'll find yourself without a job and without a roof, and there won't be enough left of the charity in this town to give you either one back. She looked up then. Thank you, Doyle. I'll think on that. He held her gaze for a moment longer, looking for something. Then he pushed off the door frame and walked back toward the yard. Calla set down the pitchfork. She stood for a moment in the dim of the stall with the warm flank of the bay mare beside her, and breathed. So it had already gotten back to Peck. That meant he was watching. That meant the land office conversation had been reported, which meant someone in that room, the clerk or one of the two seated men, was connected to Harlan Peck in a way she had suspected, but not yet proven. And that meant Peck was more worried than he appeared. People did not threaten things they were not afraid of losing. She picked up the pitchfork and went back to work. The sheriff's office was a square room with 2 windows and a desk, and a rack of long guns on the wall that had not been touched in months. Silas Croft sat behind the desk when she came in at 3 in the afternoon, the flat light of the dying October day coming in at an angle through the window and falling across the surface between them. She placed the tin box on the desk. He opened it. He read each letter carefully, without rushing, which was a thing she had not expected from a man who had other business to conduct. He read them through once, then went back and read 2 passages again. Then he set them down and looked at her. "Your father wrote clearly," he said. "He was a careful man. What's the survey mark say? On the post. T. Briggs, 1863, North Ridge, his land marker. He put survey stakes at all 4 corners, but the northeast post is iron, not wood. The wood one's rotted years ago. The iron one's still there. You've checked it recently? 2 weeks ago. It's there." Silas folded his hands on the desk. The silver at his temples caught the light. Peck filed the deed with a witness signature from a man named Galt. "You know him?" "By sight. He works for Peck." He witnessed a dead man's signature, documented, filed, handed in. Silas was not raising his voice. He was not performing outrage. He was simply looking at the facts the way a man looks at a broken fence, seeing where it gave way, calculating what it would take to fix it. "That's not a paperwork dispute." "No," she said, "it isn't. Did Doyle come to see you today?" She looked at him. "Yes." "What did he say?" She told him, plainly, the way she had told the land office plainly that morning. Silas listened without expression. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then, "He told you to leave it alone. He told me I'd lose my job and my roof. And yet you're here." She met his eyes. The storm grey of hers was steady. "My father worked 12 acres of bad ground for 12 years. It wasn't much, but it was his, and then it was mine. I'm not leaving it to a man who buys signatures." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, the way a thing you already suspected becomes confirmed. "Leave the letters with me," he said. "Come back tomorrow. I'll have some questions answered by then. You're going to look into it." "I already am." She stood up. She looked once at the tin box, which had lived under her floorboard for nearly a year. Then she nodded and left it there. Harlan Peck was a man who had made his money in ways that were difficult to describe precisely. He had arrived in Ember Flats 7 years ago with enough capital to buy the largest property in the valley, and enough charm to make the town believe he had earned it elsewhere rather than simply accumulated it. He sat on the town council. He sponsored the church harvest fund. He bought drinks for men he needed and ate dinner with men who mattered, and he had learned long ago that most people's loyalty was a commodity like any other. Find the price, pay it, and they were yours. He had not expected the stable girl to go to the land office. He had not expected the stable girl to be paying that much attention. He sat in his office that evening with a glass of whiskey he was not drinking, and thought about it. The land itself was not the point, not anymore. The North Ridge was worth what it was worth, which was not nothing, but was also not the reason he had moved on it. The reason was water. The creek that ran through the parcel fed 3 other properties downstream, and those 3 properties were the ones he intended to acquire next, and without the creek they would come to him faster and cheaper. The stable girl's 12 acres were a hinge. Nothing moved forward without them. He had told Doyle to send the message. Doyle had sent it, but she had gone to the sheriff's office in the afternoon, and that was a problem. Silas Croft was not a man Peck had been able to buy, which was a thing that Peck found more irritating than he liked to admit. He had tried in the early years, in the ways these things are tried. A word here, a favor offered there. Silas had accepted none of it. He had not made a scene about refusing. He had simply not accepted it, and then he had gone on being sheriff in his quiet, unhurried way, and the town had gone on trusting him. Peck set down the glass. He would need to move faster. The next morning, before Calla reached the stable, 2 of Peck's ranch hands were waiting for her at the junction where the boarding house road met the main street. They did not touch her. They did not have to. They simply stood where they were and made her stop walking, because 2 men standing across a narrow path at first light are their own kind of argument. One of them, a lean man with a sun-cracked face and no expression, held her gaze. "Mr. Peck says you've been misremembering," he said. The morning was cold. The dust of the road had not yet lifted. She could see her breath. "Is that what he says?" she said. "He says the land was sold fair. He says your father signed it. He says you've been through a hard time and you're confused." Her jaw tightened. "My father didn't sign anything." "That's what Mr. Peck says you think." The lean man tilted his head. "He also says he'd hate for you to lose your position. Says you've been a dependable worker. Says this is a hard time of year to be looking for something new." She did not move. The cold was settling into her shoulders, and her hands were still at her sides, and she was thinking very clearly, which was the thing fear had always done for her when she did not let it turn into panic. It made her think clearly. "Tell Mr. Peck," she said, "that I'm going to work." She walked through the space between them. Neither man reached for her, but the lean one spoke to her back. "Next time we talk," he said, "it won't be a conversation." She did not answer. She kept walking. She went to Silas that same morning, before the stable opened, and she told him what had happened at the junction. She told it the way she told everything, plainly, without decoration, with the details that mattered, and none that didn't. Silas listened. She had come to understand, in the short time she had known him to actually speak to, that his listening was an active thing, not passive. He tracked what she said. He filed it. When she finished, he said, "Do you have somewhere to go that isn't the boarding house?" She looked at him. "The boarding house is paid through the month. The boarding house is also where Peck will know to find you." He paused. "I have a property on the east edge of town. House and a small barn. It's not in use. You'd be on your own there, but it's not visible from the main road." She studied him. She was not naive. She had been poor and alone long enough in this world to understand what offers sometimes were and sometimes weren't. She looked at the still, pale grey of his eyes and found nothing in them that required her to be cautious in that particular way. "Why?" she said. "Not the practical reason, the other one." He was quiet for a moment. "Because you're right," he said, "and I've watched men in this town be wrong for long enough." She moved to the east house that afternoon, in a single trip, with everything she owned in a canvas bag and the knowledge that she had just made herself visible to Peck as something other than a defeated woman. Silas rode out to the North Ridge that same day. He found the iron post at the northeast corner without difficulty. The land was rough and beautiful, in the way high desert land is rough and beautiful, pale grass, stone outcroppings, the faint silver line of the creek catching the afternoon light below. The post was deep-set, iron grey, crusted with age. He crouched beside it and read what was stamped into the metal. T. Briggs, 1863, N. Ridge. He stood up and looked out over the 12 acres. They were not much to look at, but they were somebody's, clearly and completely, and they had been since before Harlan Peck had arrived in this valley with his capital and his charm and his particular habit of acquiring things that belonged to other people. He rode back to town. 2 days after Calla moved to the East House, Harlan Peck walked into Silas's office. He came in the way he came into most rooms. As if arrival were a courtesy he was extending rather than a fact of geography. He was dressed in his town suit, dark and well-fitted, the silver watch chain at his vest catching the light. He sat down without being invited. "I hear you've taken an interest in the Briggs girl," Peck said. "I hear she works at your stable," Silas said. "She did. She's been let go this morning." A pause. "She's been spreading some misinformation about a property matter. I imagine you've heard her version." "I've heard a version." "Then you'll know it doesn't hold up." Peck's pale blue eyes were pleasant, which they always were. He had the politician's smile and used it like a tool, bringing it out when it was useful and putting it away when it wasn't. The deeds filed, the signatures witnessed. Thomas Briggs sold that land voluntarily, in good health, before he died. I have documentation. You have a signature? Yes. I have 3 letters in Thomas Briggs's hand, Silas said, written in the last year of his life, specifically stating that land was his daughter's inheritance, not for sale, not to be transferred. I also have a survey post at the northeast corner of the North Ridge parcel, with Briggs's mark and the year 1863. A beat of silence. Peck's smile did not waver, but something behind it went still. "Old letters don't supersede a filed deed." "They do when the filed deed carries a forged signature," Silas said. "I sent your paperwork to the county seat yesterday for examination. I also sent a letter to the circuit judge." The smile thinned. "You've been moving on 3 downstream properties," Silas continued. "I've been watching that for a while now. The creek on the Briggs parcel is the lever. Without it, those 3 properties don't come to you as cheap or as fast. That's why you moved on 12 acres of hard ground that wouldn't otherwise be worth your trouble." He paused. "I should have looked at this sooner. I didn't. That's on me." Peck rose from his chair. The pleasant expression was still technically in place, but it had gone thin as paper. "You're making an accusation you can't back up with anything a court will recognize. That's for the circuit judge to determine." Silas met his eyes. The pale grey held steady and gave nothing. "In the meantime, I'd recommend not sending any more men to block Miss Briggs on the road in the morning." A long pause. "Is that a legal warning, Sheriff?" "It's the only kind I give," Silas said. Peck left. The week that followed was not quiet, but it was managed. Peck made 2 attempts to discredit the letters, first by suggesting the dates had been altered, then by producing a second witness to the deed signing, a man named Creswell, who claimed to have been present. Creswell was a boarding-house acquaintance of Galt's, and when the circuit judge's examiner arrived from the county seat, Creswell's account developed holes within the first quarter hour of questioning that widened into gaps wide enough to fall through. The signature on the deed was examined. It was not Thomas Briggs's hand. This took 2 more weeks to be formally confirmed, during which Calla continued to work, not at Peck's stable, but at the livery on the south end of town, whose owner had offered her a position the same afternoon. Word got out that she'd been dismissed. She mucked stalls and fed horses and went back to the East House each evening and sat in the small kitchen with a candle and the knowledge that something was moving, even if she could not see all of it yet. Silas came by twice, not in the evenings, not uninvited, but in the late afternoon, and he sat at the kitchen table across from her and went over what had been confirmed and what was still pending, and she asked questions and he answered them. And there was something in those conversations that was different from the conversations she had with anyone else in this town, something she did not have a word for yet, but it had to do with the fact that he spoke to her as if her understanding mattered and her judgment was to be taken seriously. She was not accustomed to that. She was not sure what to do with it, except sit with it quietly and let it be what it was. On the last day of October, in the morning, with the cold coming down hard off the ridge and the first suggestion of ice in the puddles along the main street, Harlan Peck was formally notified by the circuit judge's office that the deed transfer for the Northridge parcel was under legal challenge on the grounds of signature fraud. The witness Galt was taken into custody. Creswell left town before he could be summoned a second time, which was an answer of its own. The town, which had watched all of this with the careful peripheral attention that small towns give to things they are not sure they want to look at directly, began to rearrange itself. People spoke to Calla differently, not all of them, not right away, but the women she had passed on the boardwalk in October and who had looked away now nodded. The dry goods owner began to greet her by name. Small things, the kind of things that in other circumstances would not mean much, but in this one meant something she did not yet know how to receive, without feeling the weight of every year she had spent being invisible. Harlan Peck did not leave town. He was too proud for that, and too certain even now that something could be salvaged. He moved through Ember Flats in his good suit, with his politician's smile and his cold, pale eyes, and he waited. And the waiting had a different quality than it used to, because now people watched him waiting. He made his last move on a Thursday evening. Calla was walking back from the livery in the early dark, the cold by now fully settled in, the sky above the ridge a hard blue-black with the first stars out. She had taken the side road, habit more than caution, and she was 3 blocks from the east house when she heard the footsteps. 2 men, coming from an alley to her right. It was the same lean man from the junction, and a second she had not seen before, heavier, with a hat pulled low. They came out of the alley and positioned themselves between her and the next block, and the lean man had something in his hand that was not a weapon, but was the kind of thing that could become one, a length of leather cord, thick and knotted, and the way he held it was a statement. "Last time," the lean man said, "I told you it wouldn't be a conversation." Her heart was fast. She kept her breathing controlled. "You're doing this for a man," she said, "who is going to be held accountable by a circuit judge in 3 weeks." The lean man's expression did not change. "He's a man with money. Money has a way of outlasting judges. And you're a man without a future if this goes through." She held his gaze. "Walk away." He did not walk away. He took a step forward. The sound of a horse came from behind her, not rushing, not galloping, the unhurried pace of a man who had already calculated the distance and had arrived at the right time rather than the wrong one. Silas pulled up 3 yards back. He did not draw. He sat on the horse in the cold dark, with his plain dark work clothes and the pale grey of his eyes, and he looked at the 2 men in the street with an expression that was not anger and was not warning and was, very simply, an accounting. "2 of you," he said. "1 road. A woman walking alone." He let that sit. "I've seen what I need to see." The heavy man moved first, not toward Calla, but away, back into the alley, the pragmatism of a man who understood the odds. The lean man stood a beat longer, his jaw working. Then he dropped the cord into the dust and turned and went. Silas dismounted. He stood in the road beside her and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You followed me," she said. "I've been keeping an eye on the route," he said. thought they'd try something before the judge's deadline. She looked at the leather cord lying in the dust. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly. What happens now? Both those men will be picked up before morning. Peck will be questioned. A pause. After that, the judge's process runs its course. The land comes back to you. She looked up at him. The first stars were out above the ridge, cold and clear, and the night smelled of wood smoke and frost. You could have let the clerk dismiss me, she said. You could have heard about it and done nothing. Most would have. I know, he said. Why didn't you? He considered this in the way he considered most things, without hurry, with something working behind the stillness. Because what you had to say was worth hearing, he said, and because this town has made a habit of not hearing it. She did not say anything for a moment. The cold pressed around them, and the wood smoke drifted, and the stars were indifferent above the ridge that had been her father's. That would be hers, that she had spoken for when no one believed it was worth speaking for. Thank you, Silas, she said. His name came out of her mouth simply, without ceremony, the way you say the name of someone you have decided to trust. Thank you, he said, and she understood that he meant something different by it, something she was not ready to ask about, but was not afraid of, and that was new. Harlan Peck held on through November with the determination of a man who had never been told no, and was not fluent in the concept. He retained a lawyer from the county seat. He called in every favor he had stored over 7 years of calculated generosity. He sat in the land office, and in the church, and in the dining rooms of men who had eaten at his table, and he made his case. Some of those men listened. Most, in the end, did the arithmetic. The circuit judge's examiner had been thorough. The forged signature had been confirmed by 2 independent assessors. Galt, facing a charge of false witnessing, gave a full account in exchange for leniency, and that account named Peck directly and specifically and without ambiguity. Creswell's disappearance was treated by the court as its own form of testimony. On the 14th of November, the original deed transfer was vacated. The North Ridge parcel was returned to the estate of Thomas Briggs, and formally transferred to his daughter, Calla Briggs, the only heir. She stood outside the land office. On the afternoon the paperwork was completed. The same door, the same boardwalk. October had moved into November, and the cold was real now, the kind that came down off the ridge and stayed, and her breath made small clouds in the air. She held the documents in both hands, her hands that were sun-dark with freckles and small-framed and hard from 12 years of physical work that nobody had ever thought to look twice at. She thought of her father. Not the dying of him, but the building of him, the way he swung an axe, the particular set of his jaw when he was working at something stubborn, the evenings they had sat on the step of the house he built and watched the last light go out over the valley. She thought of the iron post at the northeast corner with his name in the metal, holding its place through everything. She looked up. Silas was across the street, leaning against the post outside the sheriff's office, watching. He was not smiling. He was not the kind of man who smiled at things from across a street. But there was something in the stillness of his posture that was different from the professional stillness she had first read in him, something that had room in it. She crossed the road. She stood before him with the documents in her hands and the cold between them and all of the accumulated weeks of small conversations and careful silences. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. A pause, the kind of pause that had its own shape. "My father's house needs work," she said. "I've been planning to start in the spring. It's not much." "It doesn't have to be much," he said. "It just has to be yours." She looked at him, the brown and silver of his hair, and the pale grey of his eyes, and the broad-shouldered steadiness of a man who moved through the world without apology. "I'll need help with the roof," she said, "and the fence on the south side is gone. I know a thing or two about fences," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise made with words the way words are made to be remembered. It was the kind of thing you say when the rest of what you mean is understood already, and both of them were the kind of people who had learned to recognize when that was enough. She nodded. He nodded. And the wind came down off the north ridge in the cold November afternoon, and the dust of Ember Flats moved along the street between them, and above the town the sky was the particular clean blue of a day that has settled something long unsettled, and Calla Briggs stood with her father's land in her hands and her own ground under her feet. It had always been hers. Now the world knew it too. The dust settles. The danger has passed. But every story leaves something behind, a feeling, a question, a memory. What did this one leave with you? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are in this world tonight, because these stories travel far, and I want to know every corner they reach. If you felt something, like this video, share it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe, because the next tale is already waiting in the shadows. I'll see you there.